Hey, and welcome to another video. Here I want to share an insight with you about agreements and disagreements, and an interesting way to think about why we humans agree about things and why we fundamentally always seem to disagree about things, even if it's only in a slight way or in a certain aspect of our disagreement. And one way to think about this is by looking at reality in a way that's more true to what it really is. Usually we think about the world as something objective that we humans live inside as a subject. And we all assume that we are basically confronting the same external reality. And with this, we think everybody has to agree with us because we are ourselves subjective, but we are observing things outside of ourselves which we directly think are objective, and we don't really think about everything that we observe as some object-subject interaction actually. And when we when we go to physics and we learn from fundamental insights into the nature of physical reality, that particles are interconnected with the observer. We know that from quantum physics that there's no object that is independent of any subject. And so we have to first shift our awareness to this fact that we are always talking about our very personal, very individual object-subject relationship. And with that, we think, or we know, and we now come to understand that everybody sees his own reality, even if it's only slightly different. But to go further with this is to actually not think of any objective outside reality as existing in and of itself, which we might still think when we talk about objects and subjects. But a more correct way of thinking about reality is in terms of very individualized streams of experience. And so you might think of your own complete life with every moment that you experience as one stream of experience. Maybe you can think of it even as one leaf on an infinite tree that has infinite number of leaves, and your life is only one leaf on this tree. And so all of all of our humanity, every human that exists now, shares some kind of experience. So we might say, okay, we all live on this earth and we have certain characteristics in our life streams that are similar and that we can agree on. But fundamentally, every stream of experience is something separate, and all that exists is really this very personal first-person experience. And in that first-person experience, we come to understand the world in terms of objects, which we consider not to be us. But we have to see here that that's actually another interpretation that we put on top of our experience. Our fundamental experience only tells us that there is a stream of experience. We might even go so far as to say we cannot be sure that other people have their own personal stream of experience. We can only think of this because everything in our experience seems to point in that direction, that fundamentally human beings share in an internal life and an internal experience. And I'm in no way saying that other humans don't have that, but it's a way to, or it's at least something to consider, that this is something we interpret and take so for given that we forget about it. But if we come to understand reality in this way, that actually there are only separate and very individual streams of experience then we come to understand why we fundamentally have to disagree about things, where we only can have certain areas of similar understandings and come to understand similar aspects of our personal experience in the same way that other humans understand them. But there will always be slight differences, because every person has his own individual angle. And if you think about your whole day, the experience that you're having, you will find that actually very little of this is the same in every person. You might think about some day that you walk with your friends, take a walk in nature, for example. And if you really closely observe your experience, you will see that only a minority of your experience is actually very objective, so to speak. You could say there are the trees and nature itself as a whole, let's say, that you share with other people. But if you observe your thought stream, then you will come to find that that's already something that the other person doesn't share at all. Like, even if you are talking, then they have their own interpretation of what you said and so forth. And then the feelings that you have towards your environment, they are also already very personal. They are not something that we can take for granted that other people share, and so on and so forth. There's only very little common ground, so to speak, in our personal streams of experience. And it might at some point feel frustrating, because we are usually thinking of our own experience as being very objective and that we are focused on these objects in our experience. But when we really closely stay with our present experience, then a few things are actually shared between us and other humans. And we give those, let's say, objective experiences too much value. Usually it's more important what we feel about things, how we interpret them, and so on. There might be vast differences in how people interpret the very same experience. Like, for example, if you see an airplane flying through the sky, some people might think of them as bad, as bad because they are interpreting it as something that harms the environment, while another person is very inspired by it because he wants to experience traveling and he's thinking of his next trip to some foreign country and so on. So a very similar objective experience in the outer world will have a very different internal experience. And so while we might think we are talking about the same thing, actually what we are referring to is more this whole package of what we experienced in that moment. And we seem to overlook how subjective our experience really is. And then even to think of this analogy further, where when I earlier said that you can think of your own experience as only one leaf on a tree, then you can even extend it and say there are so vastly different experiences that they are like another life form. You might say there are trees that have leaves, and then there are trees that have needles instead of leaves, and maybe different shapes of leaves. And while on one tree all the leaves are similar, but I will guess you won't find two leaves that are exactly the same. So you can think of that as our human differences. But then there are other life forms, animals, that have their own personal experience that are so radically different, even though they are living in the same objective reality, that if you think of that, you can see how little relevance actually the world has that we are living in to our subjective experience. If you have a dog and you think about what life your dog lives in the same, so to speak, objective world, you can see how vastly different his experience will be and how he understands the world, if at all, and his internal experience is so vastly different that you might say that's kind of like a needle on another tree, on a completely different form of trees, and so on it goes. There are infinite different types of personal, very subjective, independent streams of experience. And as every leaf comes into existence and dies, so do these individual streams of experience come into existence, and at one point they end. And so we have these similarities in which we humans agree on certain things because our experiences have certain overlap, or our very personal, subjective life streams have some common ground. But if you really closely observe your own subjective life stream, then you will see how little relevance this actually has, and where all of our agreements really stem from. So this is my insight into, or let's say an analogy I wanted to share. Maybe it gave you some helpful insights, and next time you have a disagreement with someone, you might think back to this and say, okay, I totally understand, this isn't personal, we just have vastly different internal lives, vastly different subjective streams of experience, and here our common ground is so small that actually we don't have a easy time finding an agreement. And maybe this helps in some of the more difficult situations in social interactions. Yeah, thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Goodbye.